Hi, I'm Hugh Hollowell, and I'm the community pastor at Open Door Mennonite Church in Jackson, Mississippi. I want to start with a line from Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. The person speaking is Atticus Finch. First of all, if you learn a simple trick, Scout, you'll get along a lot better with all kinds of folks. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. Many of us have heard this line before about how, in order to understand a man, you must consider things from his point of view, that you must climb in his skin and walk around for a while. What Lee is describing here is empathy, the ability to understand the feelings of another person. Empathy is different than compassion, which is when the suffering is entered into in order to help. Literally, compassion means to suffer with. And empathy is different than sympathy, which is when we not only understand someone else's feelings, but we share them. These are all related concepts, of course, but for those of us in the so-called helping professions, empathy is a superpower that gives us the ability to understand the feelings and motivations of others, while keeping a healthy boundary that allows one to assist those in crisis without becoming in crisis ourselves. It's the difference between being in a thunderstorm and being in a warm house while the storm rages outside. It doesn't change the storm. It only changes the way we experience it. Now, empathy isn't just a thing good people do, or a virtue that some people have and other people do not have. Rather, it's the result of a set of practices that we can engage in. In other words, empathy is a learned skill, and it's a skill that's worth learning because it's essential to our well-being and our long-term survival. So when I was 40, I bought a house. It was my first house. It was small, 1,000 square feet, give or take, in the inner city of Raleigh, North Carolina, on a block that was 1 block away from the drug dealer's corner. But none of that mattered because it was ours, and we would call it home for 5 years. Now, this house had a lot of problems, but the biggest one was that just no one had loved it for a really long time. The backyard was a thicket of privet bushes, Japanese honeysuckle, old tires and rubble. And on the edge of the backyard, high above it all, was this craggy old tree. A friend said it looked like it belonged in the yard of the Addams family. The tree was probably 30 feet tall. It had poison ivy vines as thick as my wrists growing up it. And it was gnarled and twisted from the wind and storms. It dropped limbs any time the wind blew, and it blocked a good deal of sun from my small vegetable garden that I had carved out of my backyard jungle. And not only that, it was ugly. I decided it was going to have to be cut down, and that's expensive, so I started to save money to do it. One day, I'm talking to a neighbor who had lived in the neighborhood a really long time, and we were talking about my backyard. "That whole yard is a disaster," he said. "I would just rent a dozer and raise the whole thing. The only thing we're saving back there is that old elm tree. You just never see them that big anymore." Oh? It's an elm tree? I hadn't known that. It honestly never occurred to me to do any research at all. I just knew that the tree was ugly and inconvenient and thus needed to go. But once I knew the name of the tree, it sparked a little bit of curiosity in me. And what did the man mean you never see them that big anymore? So I fired up Google, and I learned a lot about elm trees that day. I learned that they were once very common trees in the eastern half of the U.S., but Dutch elm disease almost wiped them out, and it killed 75% of the elms in North America in the last century. somehow knowing these facts about this tree changed things for me. It changed my relationship with the tree. It wasn't, it was no longer just a generic tree that was inconveniencing me, but rather it was a thing with a name, a vulnerable thing, a thing that belonged to this place, and it must be protected. So I gave up my plans for a huge sunny vegetable garden and instead planted hostas and ferns and some salad greens. I cut away the poison ivy and basically did everything I could to make sure this tree was as happy as it possibly could be. Now, this story could serve as a springboard for many topics, but it brings to mind two particular practices that are worth cultivating. And those are the things I'm going to talk about. Those two practices are curiosity and paying attention. Now, in order to understand people, in order to empathize with them, we must first be curious about them. Curiosity begins when we realize that we do not have the answer, and we care what that answer is. I have little curiosity about whether or not you can prove that 2 plus 2 is 4. I know the answer to that. And I have no curiosity about the square root of 964 because I simply don't care. But recently my blueberry bushes have leaves that are yellowing along the edges. And since this is a thing I do not know the answer to, but I want to know the answer, I'm very curious about why the leaves are turning colors. Now this seems obvious, but when you apply it to people, it becomes less so. Because so many of us believe that we know why someone is the way they are. But the truth is that we seldom actually do. The writer Wendell Berry says that it is not from ourselves that we learn to be better than we are. Neither is it from ourselves that we learn how other people function. It is easy to assume that we know why this person voted for that candidate, or why they wear those type of shirts, or why they live in that part of town. But whenever we reduce people and their motivations to a single story, that story is almost always wrong. An important thing to remember is that people's decisions make sense to them. And they are, I'm going to say that again. I think it's really important. People's decisions make sense to them. And they are made based on the information and the agency, highlight that, and the agency that they have available to them at the time. That last part, agency, is particularly important because sometimes we judge people because we would have made a different decision. But that's because we have different information, or we have more agency than they do. People never say, this is going to end horribly, but I'm going to do it anyway. No, lots of people make what are, in retrospect, bad decisions. But those decisions made sense to the person who made them at the time. Shoplifting ground beef from the grocery store is an objectively bad decision. It can get you put in jail. But if your child is hungry and you have no money, it might seem like the best option available to you. Now someone else might say, why don't they go to XYZ food pantry on Malone Street and get free food? But it turns out XYZ food pantry is only open on alternating Thursdays from 1 to 1:30 when you have to work. Or maybe they don't allow children and you can't afford childcare. Or perhaps they're too far away and you don't have transportation. Or perhaps you don't even know XYZ food pantry exists, or perhaps you're a Muslim and their only protein is pork. or they require you to sit through a sermon by an evangelical preacher who thinks all Muslims are going to hell. There are any number of reasons you may have stolen that ground beef, but I guarantee that those reasons made sense to you. And the only way for me to know with certainty what those reasons are is to be curious. When we are curious about other people, it changes things. It changes how we view the world. It changes our frameworks that we hang information on. And it changes, quite frankly, what we're willing to tolerate. After all, it's easy to think that childhood hunger is a systemic, complex problem requiring policy change at the national level. But when you learn that 10-year-old Dondre hasn't eaten in 18 hours, none of that really matters. It becomes clear why he's misbehaving in class. And what's more, your next action becomes abundantly clear. You get Dondre some food. Now. You don't wait for the next election. You don't sign a petition. You go to the grocery store or a restaurant and you get the kid some food. This is compassion. And because you're curious, you find out why he hasn't eaten. Maybe it's lack of access. Maybe it's lack of resources. Maybe it's neglect. Whatever it is, you use your curiosity and you find out. And maybe you find out there are other kids in his situation. Perhaps there's no grocery store within walking distance, and his mom can't afford to pay someone to drive her to the store. Perhaps the landlord won't fix her broken refrigerator. Perhaps he gave his lunch to his 4-year-old brother who was hungry. Whatever. You look into it. You have conversations. You ask around. You ask Dondre. You learn. And in time, you will develop empathy. You learn the motivations that drive Dondre to do what he does. And then maybe you do something about it. Maybe you organize a ride share to the store. Maybe you suggest to the landlord it would be in his best interest to obey the law and fix the refrigerator. You make sure they have access to the resources they need. And now you know more about childhood hunger than you did before. And Dondre is safer than he was before. And the world is a little bit better than it was before. And maybe kids are a little bit better off than they were before. But none of that would have happened if you were convinced you understood childhood hunger. None of that would have happened if you were not curious. None of that would have happened if you just gave the kid a sandwich and moved on. The world begins to change when we ask, why? Now, the second practice I want to encourage you in is to pay attention. That's it. Just pay attention. I know it sounds simplistic, but most of life is really ran on autopilot. You get in your car, you drive 20 minutes to work, you walk inside, sit at your desk, and you have no memory of anything that happened on that trip. None. You were on autopilot. And when you're on autopilot, nothing changes. Nothing. It was paying attention to what a serving size actually is that helped me lose 37 pounds in 5 months. It was paying attention to how I feel after a 3-mile walk versus how I feel after a 3-mile run that taught me I am a walker and not a runner. It was paying attention to how I feel after eating ice cream that got me to have my blood sugar checked. It was paying attention to Dondre that taught us that Dondre didn't have access to food. And paying attention to how people respond has made me a better communicator and a more empathetic listener, and ultimately a better pastor. When we pay attention, when we go off autopilot, and instead engage the world consciously, we enter into a deeper state of being in the world. Now, there have not been more black men killed since Michael Brown's death in Ferguson in 2014, but since then, we have become much more aware of them. Because of things like increased media coverage and viral hashtags like Black Lives Matter, when it comes to black men being killed by police officers, we've gone off autopilot, and now we're paying attention. This, of course, works the other way too. Most people would say they think the world is a much more violent place now than it was 30 years ago. But really, violent crime was at its highest in the early 90s. Rather, it's the increased media coverage of violent crime, as well as the rise of social media, that have made us pay more attention to violent crime. But even there, being aware of what is happening is the key to how you feel about it. Now today, these two practices that I've given you, being curious and paying attention, they are not everything. But they will take you a long way. They'll definitely get you started down the road. In fact, as I think about it, they probably were presented to you out of order. Paying attention is a good start, but if you're not curious about the results, nothing changes. But when we do, when we pay attention to the world around us, and then we get curious about what we find, well, then we really can climb into another person's skin. And like Atticus told Scout, we can then learn to get along with all sorts of folks. Thank you very much, and have a great day.